Okay, folks. Kathy, thanks again. Great presentation and good sense of humor. Our final panel discussion today will be on tower co-location and rooftops. So it's, I think, going to catch the interest of most of the folks in the audience. Joining this panel will be Janine Renaud, National Director of Co-Location for Pyramid Network Services. Peter Smith, Vice President of Engineering at B&T Group. Terry Cope, Managing Partner at Toro Blanco Group. And Todd Williams, President and Chief Operating Officer at CMS Wireless. So I'm going to let Janine, I think you want to kick it off. Is that right? Or you got a slide deck?
Yeah, we do have a slide deck.
All right. Hopefully the clicker will work now. So I'll let you guys go at it, and we'll have questions afterwards. Thank you.
So we thought after lunch we needed a little catchy slide title. So intersection direction, how to know which way to go. Who in the audience has worked on a small cell in the right-of-way, like a wood pole? A couple, nice. How about using existing city infrastructure, like a light fixture or stoplight? And then how about on a low-rise commercial property, putting a small cell on the rooftop? So it looks like, just from the audience numbers, I don't have hard math here, but a majority has done the wood pole, second has been on city infrastructure, and then the third is on the commercial property. And so through this conversation, we're going to kind of talk about some of the different opportunities with each of those deployment options and some of the pros and cons and benefits that we can help promote to the carriers. So in the selection consideration,
well, one thing about selection consideration, what you look for is what's the carrier want? What do they want? Do they want cheap, fast, or quick? What do they want? So you have to find out what they're looking for. And one of the big things we try to ask them is things like speed to get on the network. Do you want something pretty? Those type things. And that the constructability, we get told what we're doing. But these guys get to do the side, I can make it look pretty or whatever. But a lot of times the carriers tell us what they want, and speed is usually the answer. So.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, you can see a lot of criteria on this slide, and I think the nature of this slide is to show, I'm sure there's things we left off, to show how many things can go sideways, how many problems you have to solve just to get these things deployed. I think I could probably follow up on Janine's question and ask the same group of people that raised their hands before. How many of those deployments went exactly according to plan? How many of those took a lot longer than you thought they were going to take? I think we've all been talking about small cells now a lot for the last 6 or 7 years. And the reason that we're still talking about it is it's the list you see on the slide before you and a lot of other stuff too that gets in the way of sometimes quick, speedy, cost-effective deployments.
and I liked what you had said earlier today. A lot of times the perception of small means cheap. And you still have the same checklist as you're seeing for each of these sites that you have to work through. So figuring out the mechanics of making it as economical and fast, but still, going through the whole process of a macro site, it's still very, very similar to that.
And I think, the main thing about the topic today is we all kind of think row first, right? Well, we're going to go to the row. It's easy. We're just going to go. We're going to pop a pole down. Going to put an antenna up. Boom. We're done. No problems, right? And really, you need to look at and help guide interest in all the areas, because the row's not always the easiest solution either, right? There are complications. So how do you balance, going on a nearby rooftop, dealing with private folks? The row where you think you have a straight shot, it's going to be quick and easy. It offers a lot of complications. The row's getting busy, to put it mildly, right? I think everybody's seeing a ton of deployments in the row that we didn't expect to see, right? We thought, okay, sure, 5G's coming. There'll be some attachments. There'll be some poles. But we're seeing smart city solutions. We're seeing lots of cameras. We're seeing sensors that are out there. And then we're also seeing a lot of pushback on the row. So not only is it an option, but it's also an option that everyone is looking at, and that includes municipalities. And their viewpoint at looking at the row is different from, a carrier and a deployment view of the row. They're looking at it and they're pulling back. How do we conceal these a little bit? How do we get less of these? Can we do something to minimize the, clutter and the pole growth? So all of those things kind of factor in. If you're going to look at the rooftop, if you're going to look at the row, if you're going to look at, another solution, there are a few things to think about, and it's not as straightforward as we thought it might be a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so we want to run through a few slides and a few examples. Really encourage you guys to raise your hands, share your experiences. If you've got something unique, we're just kind of laying the groundwork here. So some pretty straightforward examples and maybe a couple of things you haven't seen.
So I think a lot of times when you're looking at the row and you're looking at these single carrier poles, you want to see what works fast and what's in the budget. But there's also a factor here to think about, is that long-term investment, and is this a forever site or is this just a quick fix? And a lot of times these can be that quick fix, but yet it comes with a price tag. And so like Terry was saying, in the right-of-way, there's a lot of activity, and what you see above ground is just the surface. There's stuff underground where the cities do not have maps of what's underneath in the right-of-way. So where you look at placing a pole, there could be other things underneath there that will prohibit you from placing that pole in that specific spot. There's also things on the docket within cities that you may not be aware of when you're doing your site selection. Undergrounding ordinances, road expansions, that will cause that site to just be a temporary solution. So you may just as soon get that site up on air, and all of a sudden the city is like, and by the way, that road is expanding, so we'll need you to take that down. So when you're using city infrastructure, a lot of times it's a bit more permanent. They know their light poles are there, they know the lights are there. So looking at that long-term opportunity in comparison. And so when you're looking and working with the cities, what do you see from the cities, what they look for?
Get out.
Never.
Leave me alone.
You
I
never
don't have time
hear
for
that.
this, right? These carriers are knocking on my door 4 at a time. What are we going to do with all you guys? But the reality is that when they do approve it and you do start building, you hit underground obstructions, you hit things that nobody knew about. That's very real. I think a lot of us have probably dealt with that, and you think you're just going to dig a hole and put a pole down, and that's the beginning of your problems, right? So even on that part of it, you still have a lot of challenges. But municipalities in particular, at least the ones I talk to, because I tend to get into really painful ones, are the ones that don't want much at all. They might have had a moratorium, they're historic in nature, or they have a pretty full row already, and they're pushing for solutions that are different than just put up a new pole for a single carrier. We have designed and deployed poles that can house multi-tenants, and some of them that are, or we've been able to put 4G and 5G on a single pole. These are things that make municipalities happier, but they're not always happy. So we've got to get more creative on what we can do to get deployment out there, and how do you deploy? And all of us in the room are in that same group. We've got to figure out better ways to do it. And one of the areas that we're hitting on is, okay, let's get more people on a pole. And the obvious pushback to that is carriers don't want to be on another pole. They want to do their own thing. So it really takes a municipality to push and sort of ensure that they get on the same pole. And it's still a small subset of where that's possible. But it's just one of the other challenges that we're going to encounter in the row. And then I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about constructability and some of the other row issues, but going back to that, it is possible, but it is rare to put multi-carriers and put them on one. So it's just not always a solution.
Yeah, one of the big issues, everybody in here, we've all built macro sites. Try over a 911 to a wood pole or a multi-tenant pole and off a sidewalk. That's always a challenge, or any kind of utility. And we've all, even no matter who you call, 911 or whatever, the utility, 811, you're going to hit something. And because not everything's mapped out. I mean, Peter, you don't draw everything. Mm-hmm. So we do find things that you didn't draw. Mm-hmm. But it's a constant challenge, and just Finding that 911 address out in the middle of a cornfield is one thing, but doing turn around and find it on the street side, that's even more difficult to explain that to somebody. And that's everyday challenge for our guys.
Yeah, I was happy that Terry brought forth the picture that we have on the slide there in the bottom right of the it's not dual carrier, it's dual band, I think, from the same carrier.
Yeah, so it's a little dark, but we've got 4G and 5G together on that single pole in a pretty tight environment. So
And that's real,
possible.
not photoshopped. When I first saw it, I was
It looks a little photoshopped.
You can tell it's real by the plywood on the sidewalk.
yes.
I thought there would be a lot more of that kind of application when we first started talking about small cell versus macro years ago, 6-7 years ago. I thought that there'd be a lot of kind of neat, invisible kind of applications, but I haven't seen, a lot of what we've seen has been in the right of way, a little bit on rooftops. So I think it's neat, Terry, what you're doing.
And the issue is that nobody wants to take a step that's not necessary. You want the straightest shot. If FCC says I can deploy in the row, I want to deploy in a row. I want to put my pole down, put my antennas up, and see you guys later. You're not going to be able to do it unless there's a real drive. And in a lot of areas, we're seeing more drive from residents and societies and business associations who don't want to see as much clutter. There's more and more poles on the sidewalks in front of their businesses, and you can see them around Nashville. Who hasn't spotted a small cell since we've been here? They're everywhere. Mm-hmm. But if you're that business and now there's a new pole, right in front of your window, people start asking more and more questions. So I tend to see a lot more of that from municipalities reaching out saying, okay, how do we manage this a little bit better? How do we maybe not slow this down, but let's optimize what we're doing? And so there is some initiative there and some creativity, but yeah, it's not as widespread as we probably hoped either.
I think from an engineering point of view, sometimes the right of way is a little easier for my guys that deal with that. The direct embed of a wood pole is a little more straightforward, but still, no engineering challenges probably to any of these applications that aren't fairly straightforward to overcome. That pole that you show there in your example for the dual band, that's got some kind of footing under it. There had to be room to pour that, and there had to be, conduit for the power and fiber and all that.
Well, another interesting point about these is we were working within a constraint of no new poles. So we were replacing an existing street light with a technology 5G smart pole.
Nice.
To do more things with. And cities like it because then they could build on it. So when they need sensors for meters and reading trash cans, and now they have a partner who can go and quickly and easily deploy those for them. But also, like you can see, we hadn't finished the ground there, but there's really nothing underground. It's all in the base or in the top.
Existing footprint.
Yeah,
That's great.
Yeah, because there's who knows what's under the streets in New Orleans, man. I don't know.
You certainly want to go, you don't want to go digging down there.
No. You want to keep it simple, right? So it's like you said, you want to keep it simple, remove a pole. We use custom foundation to be able to minimize anything that's underneath the row. Mm-hmm. And, so far we haven't had to move any sites, as we, put them in. So, but that is a challenge. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any questions or comments about these two cases we show here? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just shout.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
There's no mic.
John Rice with Conceal Fab, and I think that's one of our goals. But, one of the challenges is everybody says, well, yeah, let's put multiple carriers into one. And yet, you just have size constraints because of the antennas and the radios. You can only make them so small. So, are you seeing more pushback? Essentially, you just have to have every other pole going down the street. I guess.
There's a lot of that, and then there's only maybe 3 things you can do. One is you can conceal more of what's up there, and that means bigger.
Yeah.
You can do less of what's there, and that means more poles, right? Or you have to make carriers share equipment, right? None of those options are easy. But if you need an option and you need to deploy, that's how you get there. That's the only way to really push it. Otherwise, we're just pushing the same shells around in different orders, right? But if you can't go bigger, you've got to go more, or you got to share. That's the reality. And then it's up to all of us to figure out better ways to do that. Can we make it smaller? Can we conceal it? Can we make it more like something that's already there? So if we need more numbers, it's less noticeable and less impactful.
Yeah, ready to move on?
And I'm just going to kind of piggyback to what you said at the end there as we move into this side, is, it is this group in our teams and what we bring to the carriers to be creative, to give them alternative solutions. So, I'm thankful that we have creative minds out there that are looking at these sites and saying, here's an option, but here's some other ways, like Terry pointed out. Is there a way to share equipment? Could we get a higher height? Is there an alternative location that can make sense? And really presenting solutions to the carriers so that these aren't competitive. They're more about creating more tools in your toolbox so that the work can get done. So if you hit a roadblock because there is a height restriction or undergrounding ordinance, that you have a backup alternative that is feasible and that can truly happen within the amount of time and budget that you're looking for. And so that's where we move into the low-rise rooftops as an option. The cities are excited sometimes about, being, a technology and connected city. They like knowing that people have that safety and security of their phones working. So when they roll out new city applications for train tickets or city initiatives on mapping and businesses and advertisements, it's all going to work. All of our connectedness has to have what we build and bring to the industry. And so looking at these sites and seeing, where is another option so we don't have to have every other pole, have some sort of antenna equipment. The low-rise rooftops offers another option. And the cities typically do like for you to look at these alternative options and vet them out. I personally manage all of the Walgreens locations nationally, so there's 9,300 rooftops across the nation. And I will tell you, anytime we go to permit a rooftop for Walgreens, the city is very excited about their best drug dealer keeping their brick and mortar in operations. Like, those tax dollars mean a lot. And the more that a company like that can stay relevant and give their customers something they need, they're going to not close that store down. And I always say it's a signal, if there's a signal, if they're going to invest and they're going to make a site on top or build a site on top of a store, that store is going to stay. And the city likes to see that, especially if we keep it within the city perimeters, not over 10 feet above the highest roof line, that it has all the proper mounting for the wind loading. We do the right structurals and design requirements. The cities typically don't move that through an extra permitting process. You also have, access to conduits that are already established because there's utilities going into that property, and there's an address. I think it's always interesting, we were talking about this earlier, when you're looking at poles, sometimes it's hard to tell your GC which pole to put that equipment on or to take down or where to place it in the right-of-way, and all of a sudden you go out there like, this isn't the right spot, guys. Like, how did you put the pole in the wrong spot? But there's no true address, and it is very hard to bring utilities to a non labeled location. And so when you have utilities at an established residence, and a lot of times these are low voltage, so I know for Walgreens, the electricity is part of your annual rent. So you just tap into existing power, there's conduits. You're also not at capacity day one. A lot of times on the wood poles, you're replacing a pole, and then what you're building it to structurally is that specific equipment. You're not really able to change that equipment without, going through a lot of foundation issues. And so that's a nice opportunity.
Yeah, I think the low-rise roofs, I can speak for a lot of engineers. I think the rooftops, macro rooftops, can be daunting. I mean, every one is unique, really, classically, I think, but this kind of, especially small cell, the small cells we show here, small cells at an intersection, I mean, this rooftop application is as easy as it gets, right? The weight's a minimum, the ballast is a minimum, the footprint's a minimum. And if you had more of these at more intersections, I think that you'd get a lot more signal and a lot less. I mean, the timeline on these is really not bad at all. For a lot of the reasons that Janine mentioned. So even from an engineer's point of view, there's a lot of positives about this last example.
Well, I think also, for the future, it makes a lot of sense because you can lease that smartly, and no matter what 6 or 7G brings or whatever we're calling it by then, you can adapt that pretty quick. Whereas, if I've shrunk 3 technologies or 2 carriers and 2, onto a pole, and it's going to be hard to change it in the future. It's just a reality of it, but. That's definitely an advantage of rooftops. You got plenty you can do there when it's time for a change.
There's less a unique application in this kind of installation.
And the opportunity to monetize a signal. I kind of lightheartedly make a joke that there's no parties in the right-of-way. There's not a customer of a wood pole. When you put it on a business of commerce, there's a lot of IoT applications and different ways to sell in the services once you're established at that property. And so when the carrier is looking at the opportunity, they do look to see what's the business space here and how can I pull additional services from this site. And I think the low-rise applications do that for you. But this really works well when you have an enterprise that understands the business. When you're working with some commercial real estate companies that don't understand technology or the difference between the macro sites and the small cell, they'll try to classify it as a macro, and they'll really put you through the ringer for rent. And that's tough because when you're looking at the right-of-way annual rent, and then you look at a private land rent, that's where a lot of times the economics start to fall apart. But when you can work with an enterprise and a retailer or property ownership company that is more of a partnership that understands they're going to get the residual stronger signal there in and around their facility, they're going to gain some revenue in a space that nobody was leasing out before. Always make the joke, Starbucks isn't asking for a kiosk in your top left corner of your roof. But this is a nice mailbox money. It gives you a signal that your customers are going to use, and it's not invasive. So being able to leverage that in addition to some of your other city infrastructure, I think that's the quilt, and that's the way that we create these sites that are needed for the multiple carriers without having a lot of clutter everywhere.
We just use the construction. The decorative poles, they're long lead items. And most of those products right there are for the galvanizing, soft to shelf. And so when the carrier says, I got to get this quick, low-rise real estate is probably the answer for most answers for that. We can do that with a bucket truck or anything of that nature, and we're not really using the tower climbers as much. It's usually rooftop crews, and definitely quicker for the carriers.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the main thing is, most of us in the room work with carriers, and it's our job to facilitate this deployment, right? So how do we do it? There's no one answer, right? Sometimes it's going to be much better, and sometimes you're going to have no option but to go to one choice or the other, right? I did see some hands, but I didn't want to pass it up.
I could be incorrect here, but I thought that there was a very specific definition for small cell that had to do with volume.
Mm-hmm.
Yet on the A&E side, we see these structures significantly exceeding the size that's considered a small cell. I was just curious if there's any feedback on that, because a lot of times it gets presented that this is such a small installation, it's a small cell. Well, it has to be this size. And then you get these instances where the equipment is significantly bigger than meeting the definition of a small cell.
So some of us in the room have tried to call a 120-foot monopole a small pole at one time. So I don't know how hard and fast those rules are, but yes, I agree with your point that the equipment, is a driving force, and municipalities mainly, drive the height restrictions on it. But we're seeing mainly either a macro build out or a millimeter wave and small cell build out from the carrier side. So I mean, maybe from the A&E side, you guys want to talk a little bit about that, but from that aesthetic side, like I certainly agree that they're limited in height and the equipment is unique for small cells versus macro build out.
But from like a jurisdictional and government relations, I mean, you go in there and you say, I want to put up a small cell. If that was me, I would have this idea that this is a very small compact, and then you go and you start showing me the mock-ups of what it's going to look like. And these radomes are exceedingly getting so far away from the definition of a small cell. Does that cause issues in those negotiations?
From my viewpoint, from what I've seen, yeah, absolutely. And I'm on the side of make it smaller, right? So that's kind of where I try to push and help too, but I know everybody.
Well, I think, Terry, your perspective is pretty unique on this. I mean, the poll example you showed in that previous slide, I mean, you're right down in the public space, you're in the right of way, you're in line of sight for second story buildings. I think that's when it comes into play. My experience in the other applications is the jurisdictions know the distinction in their head between a small cell and a macro in a general way, but aren't enforcing any kind of limits on any of that. I mean, when I go to macro zoning hearings or something like that, they care whether it's a 4-foot, 6-foot, or 8-foot antenna.
Right.
But what I find, and I'm sure there's maybe examples in this room of people that don't fit the rule, but commonly I find that they know what small cell is in general, but not specifically at all. So I haven't seen that pushback.
And I'm seeing a lot of jurisdictions who've really thought it out, and you walk in and they're like, we've been waiting for you guys to come. Here's my 3-point plan of how we're going to do millimeter wave deployments. But most jurisdictions haven't thought about it and they're just reacting. So they just want to know what other jurisdictions are doing, and you just try to get the best solution for the city. So it's all over the place. A few years ago, I think it was even more Wild West. Now I think jurisdictions really have something in their mind about what they would like, even if they don't know how to do it. And a lot of them have really thought it out and have a plan. Our first option is we want you to do this. Second option is that. And if you have to, it's a new poll. But it varies a lot, right? And I'm working a lot more in historic and concerned areas, so I think I'm seeing a lot more of that side of it than the normal road deployment. But there's still a lot of just places where it's quick and easy to go to the row, and there's a lot of places where it's just not anymore.
Yeah.
And as long as you can keep your antenna, I mean, a lot of cities just look at the antenna count. So it's more of a single one sector macro is your small cell. So if you can have a single antenna rather than multiple small antennas, it does help that city to digest, it's just one antenna. It may be long and wide and big, but here we're just going to be one antenna. When you try to put those 3 little antennas on top, then they kind of go, well, that looks odd.
Wasn't what I was expecting.
Yeah, and then those expectations, talking through with the city, like it is. I mean, Ma Bell didn't stealth all of her wood poles down the road. We all were excited. The telephone lines were coming.
Yeah.
You're like, that's great. It's going to be there, we're not going to make it offensive, but we are going to make it effective. And so that we don't have to do a ton of these, that we can make a substantial site, and that we're not building these every half mile, that it can actually populate and hit the pops that we're looking for. Was there another question?
Yeah, great question.
No. Okay. I think we have another slide, right?
Just a Q&A slide. I didn't know if we would, people would come to the end of this and have some questions about this, so I just put some kind of talking points on there, some slides.
So I do have one more comment about the timelines on private land versus right-of-ways. A lot of times the right-of-ways, you have an agreement established, which gives you a process and a procedure. And following that process and procedure, you come out the other end with your permits and the ability to build. The mystery in a lot of the private rooftops is, what's Joe Schmo pizza guy going to say, and how are these leasing agreements going to go, and what's the timeline really behind that? And those questions are what I see is it creates the reservation on looking at the low-rise commercial rooftops, because you don't have an agreement that just covers all of them. Unlike with Walgreens, we have an MLA with AT&T, and we're able to, any store everywhere, it's the same exact procedure. But if you can, when you're approaching any sort of retail or small business or property owner, just outline the process for them in a really clean bullet point, and then give them your agreement right in the beginning so they can see, okay, this is what they're asking for. If you work through business terms and you try to talk through the whole process with them, it does get hung up and it takes a long time because you're really educating them on the entire industry that we're living in every day. So to keep it as simple and just keeping them moving to the next step by giving them that agreement as quickly as possible. I know every carrier has a kind of an off-the-shelf agreement that you guys can put in front of a commercial property owner, and then talking about the difference of this site versus the high-rise macro sites, and showing, this only propagates for a half a mile, this will give you residual benefits, but it is not exclusive to your building, and it's low voltage. I think that does help move it quicker, so that you're not just talking to Joe Schmo pizza guy, and he's like, I have no idea what you want, this is gonna take at least 8 months. You're like, never mind, I'll go on that wood pole. So just helping that process outline and giving them a template as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and I'd add one thought. I was in a zoning hearing, and this kind of builds on the previous question. I was in a zoning hearing a couple of months back, and one of the zoning board members, we were asking for a variance. It was an existing tower. We just needed a couple of foot of height. Somebody was going to grab the top of the pole, and they were going to extend a little bit higher than the existing permit allowed. But the conversation with the board became, well, what I've heard about small cells, can we just do small cells? And I'm like, okay, well, it's a 150-foot tower. They're right at the top. They're going to get all that propagation from RF. I tried to explain to them, yeah, we can absolutely do small cells, but there's going to be how many antennas on how many poles all over your jurisdiction, and you're a normal-sized town in a state on the eastern seaboard. We're going to have lots of these potential macro versus small cell situations in your town. So we could probably put 100 small cells in your town to service the 5 or 6 macro towers that are involved. Or you can let us just grab the top of this one pole that's already behind this business, and we can all just move down the road. And I really don't think the people in the city, I think that's a great deal for them. It's an existing tower, and we're grabbing it on top. And
you're not having to bring fiber to all these miscellaneous
No,
points.
and then we can talk about the infill conversation, right? That happens at intersections and happens at really busy places all over these cities.
All right.
All right, I think that's all we had. Thanks for your time.
Okay.
Smooth.
If no other questions, thank you, group.
All right.